Okay, here we go with chapter 4. And so we're going to kind of cover prenatal development and birth in this one. So at the end, here's some um, student objectives. Here's what you should be able to identify or define by the end of this chapter. And here we go. So let's get started. Of course, the first thing we're going to talk about is DNA, chromosomes, and genes. And so here's an explanation of such. And of course, alleles are important. We're going to talk about those here because they might be, and I'm sorry the T is cut off there, but it's traits with single gene dominant and recessive inheritance is going to be there. Here's some examples, but sometimes it's not complete. It's called incomplete dominance. And so what happens is the phenotype is influenced primarily, but not exclusively, by the dominant gene. So here we see sickle cell anemia, which is more common in African American people, and we see that one child is very vulnerable. One child has sickle cell, and one is actually has sickle cell anemia, but it's not complete. And so therefore, actually, they found that children with that become resistant to malaria. So it could be very helpful. Most of our inheritance is polygenic. In other words, our traits are from many different genes rather than just one. Sometimes we say, well, there's the happiness gene or the depression gene or whatever, but more likely than not, it's polygenetic. A genotype is just basically your genetic makeup. The phenotype is how it's expressed. In other words, what do I see when I look at you? I see the expression of the genes. Are you tall? Are you short? Do you have brown eyes? Do you have blue eyes? Do you have green eyes? So forth and so on. So now, and of course, you learn this in high school with the sex chromosomes and how they play out. And of course, dad determines the sex of the children. And so one thing I do want to talk about here, I'm sorry, is males are more vulnerable to X-linked recessive disorders because they don't have that second X. What happens is sometimes females might be vulnerable to it, but the X chromosome, the extra X chromosome, picks up the slack, so to speak. It's like brain plasticity when neurons take up for other neurons that have been damaged or destroyed. And so there's X-linked inheritance, which of course males are more vulnerable to, things like color blindness. Behavior genetics is what we're going to talk about here, is really the interplay, once again, between biology and the environment. And this is something that we're going to talk about from prenatal development all the way till death, is the interaction between the biology and the environment and how one affects the other. How do they do these studies? They do them with twin studies and see, are they with their biological parents? Are they with adoptive parents? And those types of situations. Epigenesis, okay, is this interaction. In other words, are genes turned on or are they turned off? Does the environment turn a gene on or does it turn it off? So I might we see this where possibly a child fight or flight response has been affected because of early childhood trauma. We see that possibly weight can be affected by the environment. The reaction range is just a gene is set to express itself, but how will it express itself in relationship to environmental contingencies? In other words, there's a genetic predisposition to be intelligent. However, what is the environment that gene is developing in? Is it a nurturing, caring, stimulating environment or not? Is there proper nutrition? Athletics would be another one. Might be very athletic genetically predisposition-wise. However, I never practice. I never go out and work out in any way. Sandra Scar came up with this, and it's the relationship between there's a correlation between genes and environment, and one is the passive genotype. In other words, I'm born into a family, and I take the genetic predispositions, and I exhibit those types of behaviors. In other words, I just say I have music, and both my parents are musicians, so I have a possible musical disposition, and so I start to pick up the environment. In other words, there's a lot of instruments being played and so forth, so I'm very interested in strumming the guitar or pounding on the piano or hitting a drum. Evocative is when the characteristics evoke a response from others. So in other words, I show an interest in music, and so my parents run out and buy me a musical instrument. But this also can be dispositional. So you have a very easy child who's calm and gets along well with the environment, and it creates a calmer environment, whereas you might have one that's a very difficult child and it evokes kind of some stress or distress on the environment. And so we see that the environment in the home can be affected by the child's temperament or disposition. And then the active genotype, or what's called niche picking, is we just find others that share the same interests. And so therefore so if I'm musical, I find other musical people. If I love to skateboard, I skateboard with other people. And if I ski with other people. If I love computers, I get with other computer people. This would be one where some psychologists would say that environment is actually more important than genes or even family, because what happens is we go out and we pick our friends, and so we might say, well, why, that is such a good family, why is that child in jail? Well, it's because the child started to go out and niche pick, and what they did was they got in under the influence of other children that led them to a life of crime. So some would say that therefore the most important factor in our development are the groups we end up in. And sociogenetic problems, of course, Down syndrome, more common with children that are born to older mothers, but also older fathers can play a role in this. And it's just that there's 3 copies on the chromosome 21 rather than just 2. And so here are the characteristics of a child with Down syndrome. Another would be Fragile X, which is the most common. And there's a part of the gene that just is overactive. And of course, males, again, are more likely to be affected because they don't have that extra X chromosome to cover for this. For women or girls, it might be Turner syndrome, where they have X and a non-expressed second X, or they don't have it. Of course, one of the problems here would be sterility. Klinefelter syndrome, for males, again, sterility would be an outgrowth of this. For these 2 disorders, sometimes these people don't know about their disorder clear into adulthood until they're adults. Here's the development by trimester, and this is right out of your book, and so you can look at these and see what's happening in each trimester. What I want to talk about is the 3 main periods of prenatal development. One is called the germinal period, which some women might not even know they're pregnant during this time. This is when a lot of miscarriages take place. And then the embryonic period, which is we're going to talk about as a very critical period, and then the fetal period would be the last. During the germinal period, there's a ball of cells that are developing. They've doubled every 24 hours. They have 2 layers, the trophoblast, which is the outer layer, protective and nourishing layer, and then the embryonic disc, which is going to actually become the embryo. And then, of course, we have the amniotic sac that is starting to develop, which will provide protection and a climate for the developing fetus. The embryonic period is really critical, all right, because there's many uh, critical developments taking place during this time. So you have the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, which we have the development of the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the respiratory system, which are critical. So we have um, the central nervous system developing, we have the heart developing, and the lungs. So we see that after week 3 already, things are starting to happen with the central nervous system. Um, and we start to, within 4 weeks, the heart is starting to beat. So some very critical developments very early on. And you see the others that happen up through week 8. Also, what's happening, of course, is the brain is developing as a part of that central nervous system. And so then basically in the fetal period, everything just kind of gets bigger. You can tell whether it's a male or a female. Um, but also something that happens during the second period of development is teratogens. Actually, teratogens can be introduced at any stage of the pregnancy, but these are harmful substances that can affect the development of the fetus and cause long-term emotional, physical, and cognitive deficits. So alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, toxins, which are interesting because a woman might be taking in toxins and not know that she's taking them in. In other words, the air she's breathing, the water she's drinking. What happens a lot of times with teratogens, though, is that a woman might be doing more than one. So it's hard to determine exactly what deficiencies might take place if the woman is smoking, drinking alcohol, and maybe snorting cocaine. And so here's the times when the critical developments are taking place. I want you to know that there's no time in this whole developmental process that the child is not vulnerable to teratogens. And now we'll have the baby. We'll have birth here. It starts out with the early signs. The cervix is opened up. Sometimes there's a bloody discharge that goes with that because the cervix has been sealed off during the pregnancy, so nothing can get out and nothing can go in. The water breaks, which is the discharge of the amniotic fluid, and then we start to see where through the next 2 stages that labor is starting to increase. So the contractions are coming closer to each other and lasting longer. It might be a time for an episiotomy, which is it looks like the fetus is going to be too large to exit through the vagina, and the perineum is the area between the vagina and the anus, and sometimes this is cut to allow for the child to exit. There's some controversy over whether to cut or not to cut. It seems that women heal much faster and resume their normal activities quicker if they just let it tear. And so then we have the baby's birth, and then, of course, postpartum. The last stage is the placenta is expelled with the umbilical cord. And there's one thing here that often the child is given to the mother, and it was believed at one time that the child had to be put in close contact with the mother immediately after birth for proper attachment to take place, and that's found not to be true, though we still have them connect very quickly, which is a good practice, but it's not absolutely necessary. Cesareans are on the rise, and they're of concern. Are they being done too much? Okay, in the United States, so there's a little bit of controversy around it. Of course, a mother's role and changes and her social status changes with the onset of pregnancy. Her emotional state is going to change because of hormonal changes, but what's her emotional state is going to have an effect on the child. If she is good and in good health and good, having a good psychology, so to speak, of the pregnancy, then the child should be fine. If not, if there's undue stress and certain emotions, and it can have an effect on the development of the child. They found that the more the father is involved in the pregnancy and the birth, the more involved he'll be after the birth. Of course, all of these factors can affect um, pregnancy and the experience that the mother has. Um, of course, the age, is she too young? Is she too old? Of course, should she continue to use her Prozac or not? And so these are major factors. And then we have at the end, do I have a wanted or an unwanted child? Basically, solicitude versus shame. And am I up to it, or am I overwhelmed by the experience? So that concludes this chapter.